There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a television show, not the silence of a stage going dark, but the silence of real life continuing without cameras. Most people never hear it. The people who lived on those shows hear almost nothing else. Bobby Goodson heard at the moment Discovery Channel walked away from swamp loggers in 2012, and what happened in the years that followed that silence is a story that almost nobody has told in full. Not because it is complicated to understand, but because it does not fit the shape of a story that television likes to tell. There is no triumphant return. There is no dramatic pivot. There is no third act where everything works out because of sheer determination. What there is instead is something far more honest, far more human, and in many ways far more worth knowing about than anything that ever aired on the show itself. Bobby Goodson was not a television personality who happened to work in logging. He was a logger who happened to end up on television, and that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. The man who ran Goodson's all-terrain logging out of Johnston County, North Carolina, had spent decades developing a very specific and very demanding skill set before a single camera ever pointed in his direction. Swamp logging is not a variation on regular timber work the way that, say, coastal fishing differs from inland fishing. It is a fundamentally different operation, requiring different equipment, different techniques, and a different tolerance for everything that can go wrong when you put several $100,000 worth of machinery into terrain that was not designed to support it. Bobby had built his entire professional identity around doing that work well. The show documented it. It did not create it. When Swamp Loggers first aired in 2010, it found an audience almost immediately, and the reason was not hard to understand. Reality television in that era had become so aggressively manufactured that audiences had developed a kind of background cynicism about it. They watched, but they watched the way you watch a magic show, with one eye always looking for the trick. Swamp Loggers did not feel like a trick. The mud was real. The mechanical failures were real. The danger of a machine sinking or a cable snapping or a crew member getting hurt in a location where emergency services could not easily reach, all of it was real, and it read on screen as real because it was. Bobby Goodson did not perform competence for the cameras. He simply was competent, and the cameras caught it. 3 seasons of that, running from 2010 to 2012, gave Discovery Channel some of the most authentic content it had aired in years. And then the network moved on. The network's decision not to renew after the 3rd season was never publicly explained in any detail, and Bobby himself never made a public issue of it. This is, in retrospect, entirely consistent with everything else we know about him. He is not a person who dramatizes his own circumstances. He did not take to social media to air grievances, did not give interviews framing himself as a victim of network decisions, did not attempt to leverage whatever remaining public attention he had into a different kind of media presence. He went back to Johnston County and back to work. For a lot of people watching from the outside, that looked like the story simply ending. It was not. It was the story entering its hardest chapter. What very few people understood at the time, and what only became fully clear years later, was the financial reality that had been running underneath the show's entire production. Goodson's all-terrain logging was not a large operation with institutional reserves. It was an independent business built on specialized equipment, experienced labor, and the kind of hard-won industry relationships that take decades to develop. The equipment alone, track skidders, purpose-built harvesters designed specifically for wetland terrain, the heavy transport required to move timber out of a swamp and onto a highway, represented an enormous ongoing capital obligation. These machines do not sit still and hold their value. They work in conditions that accelerate every form of mechanical wear, and they require constant maintenance to keep functioning. When they fail significantly, the repair bills can wipe out weeks of margin in a single invoice. Layer onto that the cost of running a full crew in an industry with one of the highest injury rates in the American workforce, the insurance that goes along with it, the fuel to run the equipment and the transport, the logistics of wetland permitting and environmental compliance, and the ordinary chaos of contracting with timber mills whose purchasing priorities can shift on very little notice. And you start to see what the actual financial picture of an operation like this looks like. It looks thin. It looks like a business that can survive and even thrive when everything is working right, but that has very little cushion when things start going wrong. Bobby had managed that reality his entire career. What changed after the show ended was that the industry surrounding that reality started changing in ways that no amount of individual management skill could fully address. Through the middle years of the 2010s, the timber industry across the American South was undergoing a structural consolidation that hit independent contractors hard. Smaller mills were being absorbed into larger corporate operations, and those larger operations came with different expectations and different purchasing relationships. Volume requirements shifted. Payment terms in some cases tightened. The premium value that a specialized contractor like Bobby could offer, access to difficult wetland terrain that standard logging operations could not efficiently work,
became less reliably compensated as scale and standardization became the dominant priorities of the mills he was contracting with. This is not a story of anyone doing anything wrong. It is a story of market forces moving in a direction that disadvantaged a certain kind of operator, and Bobby Goodson was that kind of operator. His public presence during this period was genuine and consistent, which itself tells you something about the man. He maintained a Facebook presence that connected him with the fans who had followed swamp loggers. He updated people on the continuing work, responded to comments, stayed honest with an audience that had cared about his story. What he did not do was broadcast the difficulties. Partly this is temperament. Bobby has never been someone who talks publicly about his own struggles in real time. But it is also possible that through most of the mid-2010s, the difficulties, while real, were still manageable, still within the range of problems that an experienced operator could work through. The math was getting harder, but the math was not yet broken. The math started breaking in the late 2010s, and it broke in several directions simultaneously. Equipment that had been aging was aging past the point where maintenance was straightforwardly economical. The choice between continuing to absorb escalating repair costs on machines that were already working harder than they were designed to and taking on the debt load of replacement equipment is a genuinely terrible choice for an independent operator already running close to the margin. Either option adds pressure to a business that needs that equipment productive every single day it can be. Neither option has a clean solution. Bobby faced this choice while also dealing with fuel price volatility that directly attacked the economics of moving timber from remote swamp locations to mills, and while the timber market itself was going through cycles driven by housing activity and international demand that had nothing to do with the quality of his operation. There is a version of business difficulty that feels like failure because of mistakes made. What Bobby was navigating was a different kind of difficulty, the kind that arrives when you have done everything right and the conditions outside your control shift against you anyway. The specialization that had always been the competitive strength of Goodson's all-terrain logging was also the thing that limited the alternatives when the primary market for that specialization tightened. You cannot easily pivot a swamp logging operation to different terrain. The equipment does not transfer. The skill set is specific. When the market for what you do becomes less favorable, there is a ceiling to how much individual excellence can compensate. Then 2020 arrived, and everything that had been under pressure was suddenly under a completely different and far more acute pressure simultaneously. The COVID-19 pandemic hit independent logging contractors in the American South with a precision that, had it been designed, could not have been more effective at attacking every vulnerability that already existed. The first and most immediate blow was the mills. When widespread shutdowns swept across American industry in the spring of 2020, timber mills either dramatically reduced their operating capacity or stopped accepting deliveries entirely. For a logging contractor, a mill that is not taking timber is not a problem you can work around. It is a complete revenue stop. There is no sale. There is no haul. There is no reason to put a crew and $1 million worth of machinery into a swamp. But the fixed costs that the business carries do not recognize that logic. Equipment financing does not pause. Insurance does not pause. And if you want to have a skilled crew available when the mills eventually reopen, you cannot simply let those relationships dissolve. The supply chain breakdown that came alongside the economic shutdowns added another layer of damage. Replacement parts for heavy specialized logging equipment are not items you find at a standard industrial supplier. Under normal conditions, the supply chain for this kind of machinery is already narrow. During the pandemic, it became genuinely dysfunctional. Lead times that had been measured in days stretched to weeks, and sometimes longer. A machine sitting idle waiting for a part is not generating revenue. In a business carrying the overhead of a specialized logging operation, extended downtime is not an inconvenience to be managed. It is a direct and sustained financial threat. But the most sustained and damaging blow came through fuel. Diesel prices surged during and after the pandemic period in ways that directly undermined the economics of timber hauling. Bobby spoke about this publicly, and with his characteristic directness. There were hauls where the cost of the diesel required to move a load from the swamp to the mill came out close to, or in excess, of what that load would bring at the mill. When the foundational arithmetic of a business stops working, when the core transaction that the entire operation exists to complete no longer generates positive margin, there is no version of harder work or better management that fixes it. The business itself has reached a condition that cannot be operated out of. What made the pandemic period so damaging was not any single one of these factors taken alone. Any of them, in isolation, would have been a serious problem that an experienced operator could potentially work through. What made them catastrophic was the combination, all of them present simultaneously, each one feeding into the others over an extended period, with no clear timeline for resolution. Mill closures created cash flow problems at the precise moment that supply chain failures were causing machine downtime. Fuel price surges arrived when margins had already been compressed from every other direction. The adversity was not a single storm that could be waited out. It was a sustained compounding of conditions that did not allow for the kind of recovery that earlier, simpler crises had allowed. Bobby Goodson had spent his entire working life solving hard problems in hard terrain. He had kept a specialized, independent logging operation running through the end of a television show, through a decade of industry consolidation, through aging equipment and volatile markets, and every other form of operational pressure that the business had thrown at him over the years. None of that experience translated into a solution for what 2020 had put in front of him.